Let's get started. So a few reminders for you guys. If you haven't already, please take the pretest that I posted on Classroom within the next, week or so, because then I'm going to take it down. I really need that to see where you guys are at. So if you haven't done that already, please do so after this class. And also remember to fill out the feedback forms that I post at the end of class. It gives me a better idea of how I should be teaching you guys. And with that, let's get started. Okay, so we are going to be doing today the chemistry of life. So we're going to start off where we kind of left off last class. We're going to start by talking about the atom. So the atom is pretty much the basic part, or the smallest part of matter. So if you remember from last class or the class before that, I said that matter was anything that takes up space. So everything you see around you, anything that takes up any kind of space, is matter. And that matter is made up of these tiny particles called atoms. And this is the smallest part of matter. An atom is the smallest part of matter. You can't break an atom down any more than it already is because it's so small. So let's talk about the anatomy of an atom. So atoms are made up of like a ton of subatomic particles, but we only study 3 different types of particles. Those are protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are what makes up the atoms. So the protons. The protons are found in the nucleus of the atom, which is just the center of the atom, and they possess a positive 1 charge. So they just have a positive charge. Neutrons are also found in the nucleus of the atom. So the nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons combined, and these neutrons have a neutral or no charge. Electrons, so they are found moving around the nucleus in an area often called the electron shell. Recently, however, we've discovered that electrons actually move in like a haze or a cloud around the atomic nucleus. So interesting, we never actually know where these electrons are going to be. We kind of just make this cloud and assume that they're going to be somewhere in this cloud. We can never figure out the exact position of them. Also, electrons have a negative 1 charge. Okay. So atomic number and mass number. So this is kind of like applying protons and neutrons to get some numbers about these atoms. So atoms, they make up elements, and if you guys know what the periodic table of elements is, that's just a table with all of the different types of elements. So the atomic number of an atom is the number of protons in the atom's nucleus. So if you change the number of protons in the atom's nucleus, you change what that atom is. The mass number is the number of protons and neutrons in the atom's nucleus. The atomic number is just the protons, and the mass number is the number of protons and neutrons. The reason why we don't use electrons in the mass number is because electrons have such a small mass that they're pretty much negligible when it comes to calculating the actual mass, so we just don't worry about them. And the atomic number is just used to identify what that atom is. So down here, you can see on this diagram with the helium here, it shows the mass number, the atomic number here, and the atomic symbol. So the atomic symbol is helium, so He. The mass number is 4, and the atomic number is 2. So interestingly, what we can, well, first, let's just look at this. Here. Okay, so this is an example of an atom, right? So you have the nucleus, the blue is the neutrons, the green is the protons. You can see the protons have a +1 charge, and the electrons have a negative charge. And as you can see, they're also in that cloud or just the haze around the nucleus. So you can see here on the periodic table of elements, we can use the atomic number and the mass number that we have to calculate the protons, neutrons, and electrons. So that's what we're going to do now. So if let's just look at hydrogen here. That's just hydrogen. It's element number 1 on the periodic table. So the top number on the top left-hand corner is 1. And usually the top left-hand corner number is the atomic number. So that tells us how many protons there are. Then we have H, which is the abbreviation for the element, or hydrogen. Then you have 1, and 1 is for the neutrons. Sorry, not the neutrons, the mass number. So what we can calculate from this is we can calculate the amount of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So we know that 1 is the atomic number, so that already gives us the protons, because the atomic number is the amount of protons. But for this mass number, we have 1.00794. So for this course, we're just going to round the mass number because that 0.00794 does not really matter. So in this case, our mass number would just be 1. So, if we have our mass number is 1 and we have 1 proton, then we're going to have 0 neutrons, because protons plus neutrons should be equal to the mass number. Now, for electrons, you have to think about the charge. So if we know that we have 1 proton and 1 neutron, or 0 neutrons, then the charge of this is going to be +1. And all of these atoms or elements on the periodic table are neutral, meaning they have no charge. So if we have 1 proton, meaning just a +1 charge, then we want to cancel out that +1 charge. And the way to do so is to put in 1 electron. So based on this information, we can assume that hydrogen has 1 proton, 0 neutrons, and 1 electron. So I want you guys to do the same thing that I just did for helium, which is element 2. So just use the numbers and figure out the protons, neutrons, and electrons in this element. Okay, so the answer to this was we would have 1 or 2 protons, 2 electrons, and 2 neutrons. The way we figure this out, remember the atomic number is 2. So that means that we would have 2 protons. We know that our mass number, we round that, so that becomes 4. So we'll have 4 minus 2 should be our amount of neutrons, so that's also 2. And then remember that the protons has to be equal to the electrons to make the atom neutral. So that would give us 2 electrons too. So 2 protons, 2 neutrons, 2 electrons. Now I have a more interesting one. So I want you guys, let's just say, to do germanium, which is number 32 here, GE, right here. Can you guys see it okay? Let's make sure. So it's 32 germanium right here. Okay, so the answer was 32 protons. And because of that, there would be 32 electrons. And we would actually have 41 neutrons. The reason for that is because 32 obviously is the atomic number. So that's going to be equal to the protons. And then the charge has to cancel out. So it's going to be 32 electrons. But the interesting thing is germanium, remember that we always round the mass number. So in this case, it's 72.64. So it'll round up to 73. 73 minus 32 is 41. So we'll have 41 neutrons. So that's how you calculate protons, neutrons, and electrons, just given periodic table and mass number or atomic number. So now what we're going to get into is ions and a little bit more chemistry. So let me just share here. Can everybody see okay? Okay. So what we have here, let's see. Okay. So ions, right? So an ion is an atom that has gained or lost one or more electrons. And an ion forms because an atom is most stable when its outermost energy level is full. And so when you gain or lose electrons, it results in a full outermost energy level. So I think we have to get into energy levels first. My bad. So energy levels pretty much are just the levels that contain electrons. So if you look at this oxygen atom here, you can see that this inner energy level has 2 electrons. Then this outermost energy level has 6 electrons. And there's certain properties of these. There's certain properties of each of these electrons. So here, so each shell or level is restricted to the number of electrons it can contain. So the first shell, which is the shell closest to the nucleus, never contains more than 2 electrons. Then the second shell can never contain more than 8 electrons. Then from there, it goes to 18 and 32. You guys just need to note that the first 2 shells are 2 and 8. And the first shell can't contain more than 2. The second shell can't contain more than 8. And also, if you guys have any questions, just type them in the chat to me. That's easiest. And so now what we can do is we can go back to our periodic table here. So in the periodic table of elements here, what we can see is that, let's go to hydrogen again. So if you look at hydrogen, there's a number right here, which is this 1. And so this 1 symbolizes the shells, right? Or the electrons in the amount of shells. So if you look down, maybe at like lithium, right? Lithium has a 2 and then a 1. This means that the first shell has 2 electrons, and then the second shell has 1 electron. You look at sodium, the first shell has 2, the second shell has 8, and the third shell has 1. Now remember, this follows the properties that we said. You want your shell to be full before you move on to the next one. So in this case, in lithium, the first shell fills up, so then it starts to put electrons in the next one. In sodium, the first and the second shell fill up, so it's going to start putting them in the third shell. So the thing about these elements, though, is they always want to have their like a full shell. If you have any electrons like straggling along, like this sodium does, that's not good. And so that's how elements will form ions, because they will try to get rid of their electron, and when they do, they'll have a +1 charge. Because with this 1 electron straggling on, if you get rid of it, then you're happy because your shells are full. So that will create the sodium to have a +1 charge. Another example, if we go across here, is chlorine, element number 17. So if you look at chlorine, its first shell is 2, so that's filled. The second shell is 8, that's filled. But then the third shell has 7, so that's not filled. So what chlorine wants to do is it wants to get an electron. So it wants to take up an electron. This will give it a negative charge, creating an ion, but its shell will be full because it'll have 8 electrons. Whenever you have 8 electrons in a shell, that shell is full. So this is what we see in ionic bonds. So if I go back here, one second. Okay, so here, what we can see is an ionic bond. So ionic bond is, one example is between the sodium and chlorine we just talked about. So in this case, sodium, remember that we said it wants to get rid of an electron, but chlorine wants an electron. So what's going to happen is that sodium, if you look at step 1 here, the sodium is going to lose an electron chloride. So sodium is just going to give chloride an electron. Then what happens is the sodium now has a positive charge, and the chloride now has a negative charge. Because remember, the sodium just gave away an electron, so that's going to give it a positive charge. And the chlorine just took up an electron, so that's going to give it a negative charge. So what happens is because, one is positively charged, one is negatively charged, these are going to attract each other. And what happens is it forms an ionic bond. And so this magnetic attraction between the two, or these two elements, is what forms an ionic bond. There's also another type of bond that's called covalent bonding. So covalent bonding is more like a share, right? They start to share electrons. So in the example here, we have carbon and oxygen forming CO2. So a carbon atom needs 4 electrons to fill its outer energy level, and an oxygen atom needs 2 electrons to fill its outer energy level. So what happens is the carbon atom will actually share some electrons with the oxygen atom. So if you read here, it says in carbon dioxide, carbon makes a double bond because it shares 2 pairs of electrons with each oxygen atom. So what carbon is going to do is it's going to take those electrons in its outer shell, it's going to move them so those electrons are in closer proximity with the oxygen, and then pretty much the oxygen will come over and start to include those electrons in its second shell. And so pretty much what this does, because they move closer and they start to share, that is what a covalent bond is. Does everybody understand the difference between ionic and covalent? Okay. If you have any questions, please type. Yeah, so an ionic bond is just when a positively charged a positively charged element is attracted by a negatively charged element. And that's just what an ionic bond is. They're just pretty much attracted to each other, and so that's why they bond. The reason why they're charged is because they want to get rid or take an electron to fill in their energy shell. Okay, so there's 2 different types of things, or 2 different types of like bonds, or not bonds, but like how atoms can mix and they can bond. So you have a compound. The first is a compound. A compound is a substance made of atoms of different elements bonded together into a certain ratio. So common compounds are water or carbon dioxide. And notice that they contain different elements. Compounds always contain different elements. So for example, in water, you have H2O, which means that you have 2 hydrogens bonded to an oxygen. And because these are different elements, this is considered a compound. If let's say it was oxygen bonded to oxygen, this is not a compound because you don't have different elements. They're the same element. The other type is a molecule. So a molecule is two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. So this can be any two atoms. It can be the same element. So the example above where we used oxygen, oxygen gas, O2, it consists of two oxygen atoms that share electrons. So that's a molecule. But also water is also a molecule as well as a compound, because a molecule is just any elements or atoms that bind. So therefore, molecules such as like H2O are also going to be compounds. So let's do a little bit of review here. So the first question is, what distinguishes one element from another? Just type your answers in the chat. Okay, so it looks like a lot of you guys got it. Remember that one element from another is always the atomic number or protons. Neutrons and electrons do not distinguish one element from another. It's always the amount of protons. Okay, so number 2, describe the formation of an ionic compound. Just type your numbers in the chat. Or not your numbers, your answers. All right. So an ionic bond is just formed between two elements. So remember how I said that there are certain shells that these elements always want to fill. So for example, sodium had one extra electron in that third shell, but it doesn't want that. It wants to have full shells. So one extra electron, it needs to get rid of that. So what it's going to do is it's going to get rid of that. And that electron is going to travel to chlorine. And chlorine, see, it has 7 electrons, meaning it's missing one to have a full shell. So what it's going to do is it's going to take that electron, that sodium kind of kicked out of its atom, and it's going to take that up for itself. But what happens now is because you removed an electron and added an electron to a molecule or to an element, the sodium is going to have a positive charge because it lost an electron, and the chlorine, or it's going to have a negative charge because it has that extra electron. So opposite charges will attract each other, and so that sodium and that chloride will attract, and this makes salts. So that's what an ionic compound, or how it is formed. So what is the difference between an ionic bond and a covalent bond? Type your answers in the chat. Okay, so remember that the main thing is that the main thing about a covalent bond and an ionic bond is that covalent bonds share electrons and ionic bonds take electrons. So that's the biggest difference. You can also say that I saw some answers saying that ionic bonds is between nonmetals and metals, and covalent is from nonmetals to metals. That is also correct. And so covalent bonds is it's not actually involved with any kind of attraction. When we start getting into energy, you'll see that it's the most energetically stable state for this oxygen atom, the carbon atom, and the oxygen atom. So that's why it kind of just happens, like they just bump into each other, and that's what happens. While the salt example with sodium and chloride, which is ionic, it's kind of more of an attraction. So number 4, how does a molecule differ from an atom? Just type your answers in the chat again. All right, seems like everybody got this, that molecules are bunches of atoms and atoms are just kind of atoms. So that's good. This is not a question, but how does a molecule differ from a compound? Just type your answers to that in the chat. All right, so seeing a bunch of answers here, but the main thing is that a compound is made up of atoms of different elements. That's the key thing, different elements. Compound is just different elements. So for example, with carbon dioxide, you have a carbon element and an oxygen element. Therefore, it's a compound. If, for example, you just had oxygen gas, which is just O2, which is just an O and an O, if it's just that, then it wouldn't be a compound because you have 2 of the same elements bonded together. A molecule, on the other hand, is just any 2 atoms that are held together by covalent bonds. That's it. So that's the biggest difference between the 2. Okay, so okay, yeah, let's actually do 5. 5 is a little bit more difficult. Let's see if you guys can get it. So explain why a hydrogen atom can be either an ion or part of a molecule. Okay, so remember that an ion is anything with a charge. So if we wanted to make a hydrogen, an ion, what we could do is we could give it an electron. Because remember, it wants to get a full shell. It has 1 electron, it needs 2 to get a full shell. Because remember, 2 is the amount that the first shell can take. So if we give it an electron, what happens is it suddenly has a negative charge. This would make it an ion. Now, to become part of a molecule, remember that it needs to bond with something. So we know that there are 2 types of bonds. There's covalent and ionic. So when it becomes an ion, it could participate in an ionic bonding. This could make it part of a molecule. or if it wants to, or if it's just, in its neutral state and it wants to share electrons, it could also do that. And that would also, fulfill its shell and make it part of a molecule. So those are the ways it could become part of a molecule. So let's go to properties of water here. So water is a really important molecule. It makes up like 70% of our bodies. And there's certain properties of water that are, really, really important. Before we get into this, our time limit is about to run out. So if you guys could quickly just log off and log back on so the timer resets, we can continue, that would be great. I'm going to end the meeting, so just join back when I do. Okay, so water, that's where we left off. So we're now going to be introduced to a new type of bond. Remember we talked about covalent and ionic bonds? Well, this new type of bond called polar covalent bonds. So pretty much what this means is that the sharing of electrons can sometimes be uneven. So what does this really mean? So some molecules are more electronegative, as they call it. And electronegativity just means how badly they want these electrons. So for example, oxygen is a very, very electronegative molecule. So when it's in a covalent bond, it tends to hog all of the electrons. So in water, what's going to happen is when you have these two hydrogens sharing their electrons with oxygen, these electrons are going to be hogged by the oxygen. What this means is that you're going to have kind of a negative charge on the oxygen because the electrons are being hogged there. And remember that electrons have a negative charge. So you're going to have a slight negative charge around the oxygen because it's hogging the electrons. And around the protons, because they don't have these electrons anymore, you're going to have a slight positive charge. And this creates what we call a polar molecule. And this happens through polar covalent bonding. And so pretty much polar molecules are just like magnets. Magnets have poles, usually north and south. In this case, the poles are negative and positive. So, right, so now so we've been talking about a lot of bonding like in molecules. So like covalent bonds are bonds between elements in the same molecule. Covalent or ionic and also polar covalent, they're all in the same molecule. But there's another type of bond. It's called hydrogen bonding. So between water molecules, you can have what's called hydrogen bonding. And what this is that because our hydrogen has a positive charge and our oxygen has a negative charge, those will attract each other. So if you look in this picture here, you can see that these positive hydrogens are being attracted to the negative oxygens. So what this does is it creates a hydrogen bond where the positive hydrogen is being attracted to the negative oxygen. So these hydrogen bonds are really important because it makes water a polar molecule, meaning it has a charge. And so this hydrogen bonding doesn't only occur just in water, it occurs all throughout your body with tons of different types of molecules because of these polar covalent bonds that are being formed. So because of these polar covalent bonds, you have a few properties. So the first property is a high specific heat. And what this means is that these hydrogen bonds, they resist changes in temperature. So for example, if you want to boil a pot of water versus boiling a pot of milk, boiling a pot of water takes a lot longer than boiling a pot of milk because this water is so much more resistant to the change in temperature. This is because these hydrogen bonds, they're very strong. And so what this does is it creates a high specific heat it creates a high specific heat. Because if you think about how water boils, what has to happen is these hydrogen bonds, they have to break. When the hydrogen bonds break, the water molecules gain energy from the heat. And when they gain energy, they can move around, they bump into each other. Sometimes they even become a gas and float off. So because water has hydrogen bonds, it gives it a very high specific heat, or it's very resistant to changes in temperature. The next property is cohesion. What cohesion means is that there is an attraction among molecules of a single substance. So for example, if you take water and you stick it and you put water next to it, the water will start to connect with each other. So that's why we see hydrogen bonding. These hydrogen bonds that are being formed between water is cohesion. Adhesion, on the other hand, is attraction of molecules of different substances. So for example, if you look at the figure 2.2, or just this picture here, it says water surface, or not surface tension, but if you look at the spider, or the insect, it's actually, its little things are actually sticking to the water. That's an example of adhesion. So that's the difference between cohesion and adhesion. The one other property that's also shown here is surface tension. So surface tension is pretty much how much energy it takes to break the surface of water. Now you might think that probably doesn't take much energy, but because water has these hydrogen bonds, it makes it actually really hard to break for very light organisms like the spider. So because it has hydrogen bonds, water surface or hydrogen bonds are very strong bonds. So it makes water hard to break, which gives it a high surface tension. And this allows for these animals or like insects, to start walking on the water. So that's another property of water. So next thing is that water is what they call a universal solvent. What this means is that many compounds will dissolve in water. So for example, because water is polar, it has a positive and negative charge. The way things dissolve is that actually they, because of their charge, they actually bind with the water. And another example of adhesion. Because they bind with the water, what this does is it kind of like makes these molecules split apart. So for example, with salt, remember how we said that was sodium and chloride binded together through an ionic bond. But when you put that salt in water, the sodium and chloride actually disassociate. And the reason for that is because water also has a charge. So the sodium suddenly doesn't want to bind with the chloride anymore. It actually wants to bind with the negatively charged oxygen. And so what this does is it breaks apart this salt molecule, and this is what dissolving is. So a little bit of terminology here. A solution is a mixture of substances that is the same throughout. And so it's homogeneous. Homogeneous just means same throughout. So it's a homogeneous mixture. Solutions have two parts. It's the solvent, and that's the substance that is present in greater amount. Remember how I said that water is the universal solvent. So it's the substance that dissolves the solute, which is the thing that dissolves. So solute is the things that dissolved, and the solvent is what it dissolves in. So there's also, however, not all molecules are polar. So nonpolar substances such as fats and oils, they don't dissolve in water. And so the difference between nonpolar molecules and polar molecules is that nonpolar molecules don't have these poles, or like the charged regions on magnets. So they're not attracted to the polar molecules, and this means that they don't break up. Because remember that the reason that things dissolve is because the water kind of attracts each of the pair and breaks it up. So that's why they say oil and water don't mix, because they're just not going to dissolve with each other. So just to answer some questions, so a polar bond is, well, it's actually a polar covalent bond. It's a bond that forms because one of the elements hogs the electron, and this creates, or so the electron will spend more time around that element, which creates a negative charge around that one. And the other element, which is kind of losing the electron, it gets a positive charge, which creates the molecule, or which allows the molecule to be polar. And so surface tension, which one has more surface tension? So remember that water pretty much has the highest surface tension because the hydrogen bonds are really, really strong. I think water has the highest surface tension because it has polar covalent bonds. So soap and oil, both of those are nonpolar, so they won't have these hydrogen bonds. Milk, apple juice, and orange juice. I don't really know about those, but I would assume that water has the highest. Okay, so now let's get into what acid and bases are. So pretty much, as I said, that when something goes into water, well, actually, water itself can break up into different molecules or different ions. So it can break up into two things, a hydrogen ion and what an OH, because H plus OH is equal to water, H2O. So you can actually have the OH and the H dissociate. What this does is it creates a positively charged hydrogen ion and a negatively charged OH group. And so if you remember last class when we talked about the pH scale and homeostasis, this is another way to look at the pH scale. So the pH scale is from 0 to 14, where 0 is really, really acidic and 14 is really, really, really basic. So acidic molecules, what they do is when they get put into water, they start to give off a lot of hydrogen ions. And this makes the solution really acidic. So stomach acid contains a lot of hydrogen chloride. And so what happens is the hydrogen can sometimes dissociate, and this will give it a very acidic nature. So that's what the pH scale is trying to measure. And then when it's really, really basic, you're going to have a really, really low hydrogen ion concentration. So that's how we measure the acidity or the basicity of a solution. So some examples of things on the pH scale. Stomach acid is anywhere between 1 and 3, meaning it's really, really acidic. Pure water, just plain water, is at a pH of 7, which is neutral. 7 is neutral. Blood is slightly basic with a pH of 7.4, and bile, which is something that comes out of your liver during digestion, it is pretty basic, and it has a pH between 8 and 9. So most organisms like to live around a neutral pH of 7, and if they get too acidic or basic, it can really hurt them. So that's why we maintain homeostasis, which was one of the characteristics of life, because if we don't maintain the pH, then we could die. So an example of something that lives in a very acidic soil is the azalea plant. It can live in a pH of 4.5, and there's some microorganisms that can survive at like a pH of 0.7. But even for these organisms, the pH is still really tightly controlled. So there's also another thing based on acids and bases called buffers. So what buffers are is something that it's the thing that maintains the pH. So for example, in blood, what you have, the buffer is called bicarbonate. And there's this whole chain with bicarbonate and carbonic acid, and the relative concentration of those can change, and this can change the acidity or the basicity of your blood. And so what this allows you to do is it allows you to maintain your pH. So if your pH is getting too basic, you might produce more carbonic acid, which will lower the pH. If your pH in your blood is getting too acidic, you might produce more bicarbonate, which is a very basic molecule. And that will make or bring your blood pH back up. So let's go to the questions now. So how do polar molecules form hydrogen bonds? Type your answers in the chat. Okay, so hydrogen bonds form from polar molecules, which remember have two poles. So you have a positively charged hydrogen and negatively charged oxygen. And so this hydrogen will attract the oxygen of another molecule, and this creates hydrogen bonds. So the next question is, what determines whether a compound will dissolve in water? Okay, so yeah, so a compound can dissolve in water based on if it is polar or nonpolar. And the class will probably end in 10 minutes once we get through all of these questions. So what did compare acids and bases? You don't have to make a chart, just write some differences between the two. Yeah, so the difference between acids and bases is that acids have a low pH, bases will have a high pH. Also, that acids have a high H plus concentration and bases have a low H plus concentration. So compare and contrast, how do polar molecules differ from non-polar molecules? So the biggest difference is that polar molecules, they have a charge because of the hogging of electrons, and non-polar molecules will have none of this charge. Um, so describe an example of cohesion or adhesion that you might observe during your daily life. Yeah, we're on question 5. So describe an example of cohesion or adhesion that you might observe in your daily life. So remember that cohesion is substances sticking together that are the same type. So, surface tension is an example of cohesion. And this is because it's just water molecules sticking together. Adhesion is water sticking to other molecules. So someone gave an example of water running up uh, a piece of paper towel. So, when that water molecule is going to run up the paper towel because the water is being attracted kind of by the paper towel. So that's why the water is going to move up the paper towel. So number 6 is a little bit interesting. When sugars are broken down to produce usable energy for cells, a large amount of heat is released. Explain how the water inside a cell helps to keep the cell's temperature constant. So question 6, type your answers in the chat. All right, so a little tip when writing answers, we do have some good answers, but just remember to always say your vocab. So in this case, your vocab would be to say that water has a very high specific heat, and this means that it needs a lot of energy to change state. So because of this, the water can absorb this heat energy and it will not change state, and it can pretty much maintain homeostasis. So the key word here was to state that water has a high specific heat. So when you're writing responses or short answers, just remember to use your vocab because that can, help your teacher identify what you're talking about. That's good too. That's a good principle to write by. So that is it for today's class. Next class, we'll continue with biochemistry. We'll start talking about specific molecules, specific macromolecules or big molecules that make us up. That'll be next class next week. Thank you guys all for attending. Please remember to take the pre-test that I posted on Classroom. And if you guys have any questions, type them now because otherwise the class will be over. Yeah, I will be linking, I don't know if I can link the materials that I used for today's class, but I will be linking other materials that I have for you guys. Okay, well, no more questions. So thank you guys for attending, and I'll see you guys next week.